To play a game is to be in a constant state of making sense of it. We learn its rules, we develop strategies, we discover its world, we escape confusion. But beyond all of these outcomes, games compel us to luxuriate in the process itself, to relish in the drama of interpretation. In Story Machines Volume 1, we looked at the mechanical nature of games and our insistence to tell stories with them. Our question was, essentially, can a machine tell a story? Do games tell stories with their mechanical elements, with tools exclusive to the medium? I argued that in the same way that we see a face in a wall outlet or inevitably conjure animals from clouds, humans compulsively project stories onto the systems and processes around us. Games, themselves procedural, systemic machines by nature, are fertile ground for this narrative impulse, an impulse that authors stories at every step of the experience. Now, in volumes 2, 3, and 4, we're going to change our question to how can a game tell a story? Typically, when we consider a story, when we think about its plot, we consider the desires of the characters embroiled in a conflict. Our motivation attaches to a character or a group of characters. Lord of the Rings only works if we are invested in the success of Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring. Hamlet is only tragic if we empathize with the young prince's confusion. The Last of Us succeeds relative to how players have absorbed Joel and Ellie's desires as their own desires. The dramatic effect of these works is contingent on sympathy with the personalities within. We'll call this kind of story sympathetic narrative. These are usually the kind of stories referenced in game reviews, narratives following characters through pre-baked cinematic moments. Here, the narrative pleasure succeeds in proportion to our identification with the characters. We'll explore these kinds of stories in the next video. But even without characters to follow, we're motivated to make sense of the world provided by the story. This is another species of narrative entirely. Always, and right up front, one of the dramas, one of the plots of a given story is about making sense of that story. Indeed, most of what we consider playing a game, puzzle solving, virtual exploration, strategizing, compel us largely because of our drive to make sense of things. Both kinds of plot I've mentioned are maybe most obvious in detective fiction like Sherlock Holmes, where both motivations play out concurrently. The audience grows attached to characters as they might in any other sympathetic narrative, hoping the case is solved and the detectives are successful, etc. But the tale is also built to encourage viewers to play along with the detectives as they piece the case together. This is a kind of plot. This kind of plot is independent from our feelings about the characters and is otherwise indiscernible from what would be called gameplay in the Sherlock Holmes board game, where the clues of the crime manifest as bits of newspaper and pamphlets that players can ruminate over as long as they'd like. Making sense of the plot forms a plot of its own. This sense-making plot is most explicit in detective fiction, but the process is inherent to all art. I mentioned it in the last video. The process of finding the skull in the ambassadors authors a sense-making plot. Or take Hamlet. We sympathize with the prince's predicament as it grows more dire and complex, but as his problems multiply, as he accidentally kills the wrong man, as he reconsiders revenge, we, like Hamlet himself, are driven to parse the twisting plot, especially after Ophelia commits suicide and bleak tragedy begins to feel inevitable. What will come of all of this, we ask? Consider the last 2 centuries of drama, cinema, and fiction, of modern and postmodern art with characters we might root for, yes, but also an array of possible meanings and reader responses. And more importantly, a spotlight on the process of interpretation itself as a decidedly narrative process. Take, for example, Ulysses, James Joyce's 1922 novel with chapters written almost entirely in onomatopoeia, or Woolf's and Proust's stream of consciousness writing, or paintings by Matisse or Kahlo, or poetry by Eliot. These modernist works suggest artists and audiences ready to consider how we understand the world. As with sympathetic plot, there's a feeling of catharsis as readers start to make sense of the text. When contemporary board games show up in other media, it's almost always for the sake of a joke about their lengthy explanations and rules lawyering. When my friends and I brought home a new copy of Mage Knight and sat down ready to digest the rules and get to playing, we pulled the rulebook out and mourned that our already generous expectations for a long game didn't account for learning the game, as solemn rules reading crept toward the 2-hour mark. An entire cottage industry of rules explainer videos have stepped in to meet the growing need for clear, concise rules explanations as game rules have burgeoned in the era of gigantic Kickstarter boxes and dense Euro games. Learning rules, by and large, is seen at best as an unfortunate barrier to an otherwise great experience, and at worst, as the primary reason to avoid any game more complicated than Scrabble. But the more games I've learned, the more that I've come to love learning them. One of my favorite moments a game gave me in the last decade came from Metal Gear Solid 5, when I got a gameplay tutorial almost 20 hours into the experience. See, Metal Gear Solid 5 goes to impressive lengths to simulate a living battlefield. Day and night cycles, weather patterns, waking and sleeping routines for the guards, staffing your military base, even animal behavior. After 20 hours of working with the rules of the game's world, the game introduces yet another system. Your base can be invaded, and you need to spend some time building defenses to keep it safe. Against the backdrop of contemporary games marketing, where all features have to be flaunted in the first hour after the tutorial, the reserve was impressive. But even better, the game was proving its awareness that what I'd enjoyed in the first 20 hours wasn't just playing with all of the systems, but getting to know them. This is eventually what happened with Mage Knight, too. Mage Knight has a standard board game premise. Warriors set out to explore the dungeons, caves, and keeps of a fantasy kingdom. However, like Metal Gear Solid 5, much is simulated. There are rules for travel, combat, equipment, and moral alignment. Any player not throwing their hands up at the complication will start to feel the wide open freedom the game affords. As the rules add up, so does the imagined possibility space of the game, and as that possibility space widens, the mind rushes to fill that space in anticipation. This is a narrative pleasure. The time it takes for players to make sense of the rules is itself charged with drama if players are motivated to master the world the rules are inscribing. And in many cases, this plot never really ends. For countless games, you never stop learning them, and that's a big part of what makes them fun. An obvious example might be chess, where despite how quickly it can be learned, the right move in a given scenario is such a complicated calculation that it can take years of practice to be competitive. Chess produces so many different board states and situations that the challenge of learning the best move given the millions of permutations you may encounter is what attracts any aspiring grandmaster. Here, it's not the rules of play you're learning, but other sorts of rules, what's been labeled as heuristics in psychology, winning strategies and best practices. In chess, or Sudoku, or basketball, or Street Fighter, playing the game has its drama, but so does learning how best to play it. The more complex a game is, the wider the possibility space, the longer the arc of mastery becomes, and potentially, the larger the payoff when a player arrives at a winning strategy. This learning has a dramatic arc. It is a story. At the risk of stating the obvious, we're only motivated to make sense when we encounter something we don't already understand. Interpretation presupposes the unfamiliar. Sense-making plots are fueled by unfamiliar territory. Like a science fiction novel or documentary on a long-lost culture, the farther a given world is from our own, the more time we invest in understanding it, the more obvious the narrative aspect of the interpretive process becomes. In Volume 1, we explored how rules, limitations, and walls create plots because they act as antagonists. These are also the tools that games employ to construct unfamiliar places. In 2023, archaeologist Tomasz Olzaki was working at a Polish castle when he found a piece of the castle's floor etched with grid-like carvings. Olzaki investigated further. As it turned out, these lines traced the board of the 16th century game Nine Men's Morris. What would have passed as a stone without further consideration was transformed with the evidence of game rules. It was made unfamiliar. It demanded interpretation. Consider how spray-painted lines convert a strip of pavement into a racetrack, or how a single deck of cards can produce radically different emotional states depending on the rule set. Rules impose upon the known world a filter of discoverability, of exploration. Games that don't aspire to model the real world, games like Tetris or volleyball or backgammon, can write new rules of being and invite us into alien places. But games like the aforementioned chess that represent certain systems or human behaviors invite us back into life with the rules rewritten. They can transform the familiar into something alien. Up until this point in the essay, I've presented sense-making plots as a species of plot, and specifically as a kind of byproduct when seeking to understand something. But we might also reverse this. All narrative, indeed all art, can be understood as a cousin of explanation, of making sense of our world. Processing the ambassadors upon first encounter elicits a sense-making narrative, but also Holbein's act of painting it is an effort to get at a certain reality too. Hans Holbein found himself in a new world, and so painted a world that viewers would, like Holbein, puzzle over and wrestle with. This means that as often as a game provides a place for mastery and understanding, it often complicates things we already presume to know. Art can invite and reward interpretation, but art should also confuse our presupposed understanding at times for the sake of refreshing our view of the world. It's a critique of Stalin's communism where all the characters are farm animals. It's anarchic stencil graffiti of a writer throwing flowers instead of firebombs. It's walking into an intimidating boss room of Dark Souls 2, only to discover the foreshadowed King Vendrick emaciated, weak, and easy to defeat. In each case, there's a gap between what was expected and what was discovered. This process is called defamiliarization. The term comes from Viktor Shklovsky, a Russian formalist working in the early 20th century. As Shklovsky puts it, art exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensations of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. Toward that end, Shklovsky claims that artists aim to defamiliarize an audience's world by rendering the familiar strange. With time and proximity, our world and the humans that populate it become unexceptional and banal. We become blind to the familiar. As the theorist and playwright Bertolt Brecht would put it 15 years later, moral behavior in a given context demands that we estrange ourselves to that context, and true art can afford such an opportunity. In the process of making sense of a game's world, we discover an attribute of art not often conferred to games: the ability to reframe reality. The best kind of game compels us not just to make sense of the experience, but in doing so to return to the rest of life with a new vantage point. Defamiliarization has several sister terms that describe largely the same phenomenon. Aristotle labeled any sudden move from conditioned ignorance to revelation anagnorisis. Media scholar Marshall McLuhan's counter-environments describe a retrained state of awareness that reveals our environments for what they are, like a fish comprehending the nature of water. I mentioned Brecht earlier. His term alienation describes the aim of art to estrange audiences from a familiar world so that they can rediscover it. I want to focus on one lens in particular, game scholar Ian Bogost's simulation fever. Bogost claims that there's a gap between what a game is seeking to simulate and the game itself, and that players come to a game with certain expectations and presumptions about the parts of life that the game seeks to simulate. If it's a racing game, for example, a player would expect steering, acceleration, and inertia to be part of that game's simulated physics. But because the world these games are trying to emulate is so complex, the simulation will inevitably reveal the limits we mentioned earlier. Players will recognize its boundedness, and as a result of recognizing its limits, recognize its otherness. This can be one of the most productive things a game can do. This simulation fever, this gap and alienation from the real world, is another confusion to struggle through, to make sense of. The sense-making plot can conclude with an empowering affirmation of the player's attempts, when their frame of reference and tools of interpretation pay off, like when a winning strategy proves effective. But what happens when those sense-making efforts aren't rewarded? When those interpretive frameworks fail? Well, to put it in narrative terms, the plot thickens. Not only can simulation fever produce the aesthetic pleasure endemic to all sense-making plots, that of being caught in the grasp of a good story, but it can produce the deep humanistic catharsis available to all art practicing defamiliarization. What sort of good can games do? Usually, when this question gets answered even by experts, the answers are pretty limited. Games can help you relax, say, or games can help educate us on the systems of the world. Games offer us a platform for social engagement. They can feature underrepresented people groups or tell their stories. All of these are indeed great things. But games can also grab us with sense-making plots that, in the process of solving them, of seeing them through to their end, reframe how we see our contexts. It's sense-making plots that can save us from the tyranny of having made too much sense of the world, that can prime our world for reinterpretation. Inherent to both sense-making and game playing is repetition. Return of the Obra Dinn, like other detective stories, lays bare this process by focusing on the repetition endemic to games and forensics alike. In Obra Dinn, a player takes on the role of a detective, inspecting selected moments from the history of a doomed ship, determining the fates of the crew, all of whom died in the voyage. The experience doubles down on repetition by limiting player interaction to one operation, hitting rewind. The first corpse you find in the game is just outside the captain's quarters. Your magic watch takes you back to the moment of death, and you see that this unknown victim was shot trying to break in. Now that you've determined the cause of death, you open your detective journal and, by returning to each scene over and over, begin building a story from the mayhem that claimed all 60 crew members. To quote Peter Brooks, repetition is a going back over in the way that storytelling must be to reality. Like a detective, going over the facts of a crime scene to transform happenstance into meaningful evidence. For Freud, repetition was a working through, a psychological processing for control or mastery over something initially challenging or confusing. The Return of the Obra Dinn prefigures this relationship between reflection and narrative making. The game shares an objective with detectives and lawyers, to take discrete pieces of evidence, disordered ephemera from our everyday lives, and render a meaningful story from those pieces by repetition. In short, sense-making is repetition. We experience first, but to comprehend and understand, we repeat. At the center of almost every game ever made is this notion of repetition. Even games that are meant to be played once, like an escape room or Pandemic Legacy, themselves involve hundreds, if not thousands, of repeated actions and ruminations. But most games wear repetition right on their sleeve. Consider the arcade game convention of giving a player multiple lives. Extra lives, as a concept, is a narrative promise to a player. A promise that, like a good story, the player will live out something meaningful, that the challenge before them won't fly by as a chaotic set of difficult circumstances, but instead offers itself primed for repetition and mastery, primed for comprehension. And that comprehension is evidence of a sense-making plot. Extra lives explicitly tell the player, this experience, like all art, is meant to be considered and reconsidered. One of the most memorable applications of this exact concept came from 2010's Super Meat Boy, where once you've completed one of the game's difficult platforming levels, the game plays back all attempts at once. It's a visual marker of your attempts to make sense of the level, your sense-making plot made manifest. While games have largely stopped giving players a limited stock of lives, checkpoint systems, roguelikes, and New Game Plus mechanics foreground repetition more than ever. Instead of lives, attempts are now called runs, like a skier returning to a slope.
This is the story of a man named Stanley.
The Stanley Parable opens on the character you control, Stanley, sitting at a cartoonishly banal desk job. A narrator announces the central drama of Stanley's story. No one has shown up to work, and no instructions have come through on Stanley's computer. Stanley, typically defined by routine, is aimless for the first time in his working life. When the player assumes control of Stanley, another conflict is introduced when we reach a fork in the office path, and the narrator announces the direction that Stanley takes before the player ever makes that choice. There are dozens of possible paths Stanley can take, some of which align with what the narrator is saying and some that stray completely. Stray enough, and the run ends in an underwhelming 3D environment with a dull anticlimax. At his wit's end, the narrator eventually condemns Stanley and by extension the player with this.
I wonder if he's happy with his choice, and if he's learned the heavy cost that comes with it. He'll understand soon what I was trying to tell him. He needs me. Someone who will wrap everything up at the end, to make sense out of the chaos and the fear and the confusion. That's who I am. That is what I mean to this world.
Here, the narrator might stand in for the player, who, without any sympathetic connection to Stanley or Stanley's background, is left with only the task of making sense of the game's deconstructed story. If the player hopes to find any meaning, the only way forward is backward. A return to the beginning for yet another trip through Stanley's labyrinthine office and labyrinthine story. It's not a surprise then that the follow-up to the Stanley Parable has an extended sequence where players replay some of the original game, and then visit the original game in a virtual museum. The game becomes a manic, reflexive investigation of repetition and the drive to understand something. In his book on Fiction's Sense of an Ending, Frank Kermode remarks that, in every plot, there's an escape from chronicity. The great enemy of consideration, our primary obstacle to making sense of the world, is the unrelenting rush of time. In stories, we find an escape from time's march. Part of our attraction to a novel or a film is this escape, not out of reality, but out of time, into a space where we might make meaning out of life for once. Consider the job of the documentarian or the reality show producer. In the editing room, hundreds of hours of footage of unfiltered reality must be rendered meaningful. Their task is repetition, to go back over reality and, by their selections and omissions, shape it into something considered. When we watch a narrative documentary, there's a relief in seeing time, interpretation's foe, subjugated. Finally, we have something ready-made for consideration. What does it mean, then, when we fail something in a game only to see the situation rewind and reset, to see the stage refreshed for another attempt? It's the same relief. Game scholars have made much of the safe space of games, labeled the Magic Circle by Johann Huizinga, a place where we can rehearse personas, strategies, and lives in a context freed from the consequences of everyday life. Part of that relief is the freedom from meaninglessness. As the narrator in Stanley Parable acknowledges, what would have passed by in life as unknowable and insignificant is transformed by the reflective force of narrative. In a game, we find the freedom to repeat, and in repetition, we find meaning. To play a game is to be in a constant state of making sense of it. We learn its rules, we develop strategies, we discover its world, we escape confusion. But beyond all of these outcomes, games compel us to luxuriate in the process itself, to relish in the drama of interpretation.